It's my pleasure to welcome you to our sixth in the series of Caste as Practice. And I just want to give you a little bit of a background about the research network and then tell you a little bit about our speakers today and the format of the panel. So Caste as Practice is a research network that arose from a reading group that we've been running in the Department of Sociology for several months. The central question we've been asking is why caste persists in every domain of life in India and beyond. What explains its tenacity and why, despite so much social, political, and economic transformation, caste continues to morph and remain entrenched. While we are seeking to understand the ongoing contemporary evolution of caste, though, we're also revisiting older debates and classics, which is one of the sessions that we are doing today. So the panel today will revisit Dumont's legacy in studying caste. And we're asking, what is it in his work that makes him resurface time and again in contemporary works on caste? If his claims have failed the scrutiny of later scholars, and there is certainly criticism of his work, why do we still contend with Dumont's legacy? Or how do we contend with Dumont's legacy? And why and how does Dumont remain relevant today for scholars of caste? So today we have three very distinguished speakers, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about them in the order in which they're going to speak. Professor Joel Robbins is a professor of anthropology here at Cambridge. His work focuses on the anthropology of religion and ritual, the anthropology of Christianity, religious education, values, and ethics, among other themes. His books include Theology and the Anthropology of Christian Life, and Becoming Sinners, Christianity and Moral Torment in a Papua New Guinea Society, among other books. And although he's not written explicitly on caste, he has written extensively on Dumont. We're very excited to hear his thoughts today. Then Professor Joel Lee, who will speak next, is professor of anthropology at Williams College. His work focuses on caste and its entanglements with religion, labor, environment, secrecy, and the sensorium in South Asia. His books include Deceptive Majority, Dalits, Hinduism, and Underground Religion, and a co-edited book titled Concealing Caste, Passing and Personhood in Dalit Literature, among other published works. Professor Surinder Jodhka is professor of sociology at Jawaharlal Nehru University. He researches the contemporary dynamics of caste, agrarian change, rural India, and the political sociology of community identities. His recent publications include The Indian Village, Rural Lives in 21st Century, India's Villages in the 21st Century, Revisits and Revisions, and Mapping the Elite, Power, Privilege, and Inequality, among many other books. So now let me welcome our first speaker, Joel Robbins, to share his thoughts with us. And as a reminder, this is a webinar, so you will have a chance to ask questions of the speakers along the way, and we will take questions at the end after the three speakers have spoken. So over to you, Joel.
Thank you, Manali. When the invitation to join this panel on caste beyond Dumont first arrived, I was both very excited and a bit abashed. Although this may seem an awkward combination of feelings, such a mix was not very hard for me to explain to myself, at least. On the one hand, I was excited because I've spent a good part of my anthropological life engaging with Dumont, and this is the first time in at least a decade anyone has explicitly invited me to talk about his work. And even before the last 10 years, such invitations were very few and far between. Mostly, I've had to talk about Dumont uninvited, and often with mixed results in terms of reception. On the other hand, I was a bit abashed because I know next to nothing about caste, and nothing at all that I've not gleaned from reading. My fieldwork experience is all in Melanesia, and my first publication was on how Dumont's ideas might be put to use in understanding the egalitarianism that used to be thought of as a hallmark of that region. Later, I participated in anthropological debates about Christianity and individualism, in which Dumont's work for a while also figured prominently. But having once, soon after my PhD, lost out on a job reportedly for the reason that a senior South Asianist on the search committee declared that I was unhirable because, quote, he thinks Dumont is right about India, I learned early on to make it clear that I read Dumont as an anthropological theorist and was in no position to judge his work in terms of its merits as scholarship on India or on caste. So what could I say to a panel about the influence of Dumont on the study of caste? Wouldn't I at best be a party crasher or an unexpected guest at a wake, and at worst come off, as I apparently did in my unhirable days, as someone who thought they belonged in a conversation they had no right to enter into. I wrote Manali about my worries, and she very kindly assured me that it would be okay for me to join the panel and talk much more about Dumont than about Caste. So I decided to take up her invitation. But as I sat down to write up these remarks, I'm still a bit preoccupied with my limitations, especially given the importance of all of the other panelists to the contemporary discussion of caste. Nonetheless, the following remarks are what I've been able to pull together in the hopes that they might make some modest contribution to a discussion I expect to learn quite a bit more from than I can hope to contribute myself. In case it was not made obvious by my opening remarks, anthropology in general has for a long time been so far beyond Dumont that he is hardly even a vanishing speck in its rearview mirror. Though a small group of people at any given time read him as a social theorist of some sophistication, about which more later, for the vast majority of anthropologists, he is now identified primarily as a scholar of South Asia and one whose work has long been critically dismissed by experts in that region. Even worse, Dumont was part of one of the last generations of Western scholars that was comfortable making sweeping us-them comparisons that now come off to almost all anthropologists as orientalizing, intellectually unhelpful, and morally unacceptable. So as far as most of anthropology is concerned, Dumont is not something one needs to try to move beyond. He's mostly just not there at all. Having said that, I need quickly to add that in the anthropological and sociological study of caste, even a little bit of catch-up work I've been able to do to prepare for this discussion makes it clear matters of getting beyond Dumont are not so simple. In his 1999 obituary for Dumont, Deepankar Gupta notes that, quote, "It's impossible today to write anything about the Indian caste system without beginning with Louis Dumont." And this is true, he goes on to say, despite the fact that, quote again, "it is not as if Dumont's position was widely accepted by practicing sociologists and anthropologists." 13 years later, fellow panelist Surinder Jodhka would make a similar paradoxical point, noting that, quote, "Dumont's book on the Indian caste system has perhaps been the single most influential academic work on the subject. However, his theory has also been one of the most criticized academic writings on caste, and for good reasons." Of course, works that are wrong about a topic, being easy targets, often get cited as often as works that are right. But I sense that something more than this is in play in these discussions of Dumont. When it comes to caste, it seems scholars can't live with him, but they can't live without him either. His work never quite goes away, no matter how often it's chased out. I'm not able with any conviction to say why this is so. If I tried, I would resort to what in my uneducated hands would be unsubstantiated cliches, just wild guesses, really, like perhaps he set the terms that still shape the debate, or wrong though he was, no one has fared much better in trying to corral this ideologically and practically complex phenomenon into a neat account. Instead of offering such broad statements that I cannot myself back up, what I want to do here is say a bit how I and some others have found it useful to read Dumont as a social theorist. Along the way, discussing how a few of his arguments that have been much criticized in relation to Indian caste nonetheless helped him to develop theoretical positions that are original and perhaps more broadly useful. As a theorist, Dumont is rather unique in bringing together a deep acquaintance not only with the British anthropological approach to studying social structure, which he learned during his time at Oxford as a guest of Evans Pritchard, and the French approach to studying ideological and cultural structures, which he learned most significantly from his only slightly older Pierre Lévi-Strauss, but also with the German approach to studying values, which, as far as I can tell, he taught himself, having learned German in the same period of internment in a prisoner of war camp that he learned Sanskrit. In the 1960s and 1970s, he was not alone in trying to work out the relationship between structural functionalism and structuralism, but he was perhaps the only scholar trying to bring these two traditions into dialogue with a theoretically sophisticated focus on values. In the theoretical amalgam that Dumont produced out of these three sources, it is values that give social and ideological structures their shape. It is this point I will try to illustrate by discussing two of Dumont's most controversial arguments about caste. The first of these arguments, and probably the one regional specialists have most thoroughly critiqued, is his claim that in the caste system, religious purity is ranked more highly than secular political power, leading priests to be above kings, or in the terms of the Varna system Dumont was drawing on, Brahmins to be above Kshatriyas. As far as I can tell, empirical research has found many exceptions to this claim. Instances where secular political or sometimes economic power can outweigh or be translated into higher status. Even when people make such arguments, however, I have a sense that a shadow of Dumont's point remains. For example, this kind of shadow hovers over Srinivasa's point that even when people have been able to draw on secular strengths to improve their class rank, quote, any claim to high rank had to be expressed in ritual and symbolic terms. Hence the notion of Sanskritization that he developed. For Dumont, in relation to ideological structures and the ways it shapes practice, this ability of religious authority to dictate the forms in which political or economic power can appear is precisely what it means for the former to be more highly ranked than the latter. In passing, I might also note that this point about a higher value being able to set the conditions for the places and forms of appearance of a lower one is at least one of the ways Dumont's famous notion of the encompassment of the contrary can be cashed out empirically. A reading of Dumont as a general social theorist can further add to our understanding of his argument that in the caste system, religious authority outranks political power by providing a sense of what this kind of assertion became in his later work. Although most firmly rooted in his reading of the Varna scheme, I've long suspected that Dumont's argument also draws on an early glimmer of a major amendment he would later explicitly make to Weber's famous account of value spheres. For Weber, the separation of these spheres from one another, leaving each to be governed by a highest value of its own, was an effect of modernity, a social formation which included religious, economic, political, aesthetic, erotic, and intellectual spheres. I think Weber was wrong to limit the organization of social life into value spheres only to what he called modern societies, as anyone who's worked someplace where kinship and affinity are two very different worlds knows well. More importantly, however, in Dumont's hand, the notion of spheres becomes that of what he calls levels. What this new phrasing adds, of course, is the suggestion that these levels are, like the different categories of the Varna scheme, ranked in relation to one another. It is this ranking that sets up the dynamics between spheres, including sometimes the encompassment of a lower ranked sphere by a higher ranked one, as illustrated above by Dumont's discussion of the religious and political spheres in India. I would suggest that regardless of the success with which Dumont deploys these ideas in Homo hierarchicus, this novel way of looking at the organization of society could be useful in contemporary social theory. For example, it would give a rigorous way of working analytically with the often broadly made point that what characterizes neoliberalism is that the economic level is ranked higher than the political one, such that the political must justify itself in economic terms, even as the economy need not justify itself in political or any other terms besides its own. For all that Dumont might have missed some of the subtleties of the relation between religion and politics and caste, then, his wider theoretical vision remains useful, and this may perhaps be one reason why he never quite goes away in the study of caste. Another roundly criticized aspect of Dumont's work, the second and last one I'll look at here, is his division of the world into non-modern holist societies and modern individualist ones. In his obituary for Dumont, N.J. Allen noted that, quote, the binary form that he gave his analyses may appear dated. Even in 1998, when Allen's piece was published, this would have had to be counted as very much an understatement. As I've already noted, anthropology does not get done by means of such totalizing distinctions between societies anymore. But as I did with Dumont's claim about the relative rank of Brahmins and Kshatriyas, I want to suggest that in this case as well, if we look at what Dumont was trying to accomplish theoretically by means of this impossibly broad division of societies into two types, we might find that there was more going on in this part of his work than those who reject it out of hand suspect. I will make my case by looking briefly at three aspects of Dumont's thinking that developed in relation to this binary and that have each had some life beyond it. Of the three parts of Dumont's work I want to discuss in these terms, the first is the one I will spend the least time on, not because it's unimportant, but because it is too complex to do much with in a short account. This is the way his division of the world into holist and individualist societies sets up his argument that a society's highest values, what he sometimes calls its paramount or preeminent values, play a major role in structuring the society as a whole. In holist societies, he aims to show, practices, institutions, and groups that are understood to support the health of society as a whole have the highest value, while other practices, institutions, and groups have less value in line with their smaller contributions to the flourishing of the overall social order. In individualist societies, it is practices, institutions, and groups that are understood to support the flourishing of the individual that are most valued and that set the relative standing of other elements of social life. This is one theoretical payoff Dumont is after when he deploys such a stark contrast between types of societies. From our contemporary vantage point, we might be inclined to decide that this payoff is not worth the epistemological and moral costs of achieving it. But it is useful to remember the scope of Dumont's ambition on this point when trying to account for why his legacy still hangs on in some or other form in the study of caste. The second goal of Dumont's frank distinction making between kinds of societies is it allows him to make an argument of a kind that is now common and widely accepted in anthropology, but that I do not think anyone had made as explicitly before him. This is the argument that modern social science is a product of individualist ideologies, the kind of ideologies that can warm to origin myths in which individuals are all at war with one another until they make a social contract from scratch to help each of them protect their individual gains. In ideologies in which society is thought to pre-exist individuals and to be more important than any one of them, one would, Dumont suggests, probably design one's social science in a different way. Thus, he puts forward the claim that what we would need a sociology grounded in holist assumptions rather than individualist ones to get anything about India even close to right. I've always thought that this is why he and Pocock called their journal Contributions to Indian Sociology rather than Contributions to the Sociology of India. It was not the content of what was studied in the journal alone that was supposed to be Indian, but also the social science itself. Through routes I can't trace in detail here, this project profoundly influenced the theoretical work of scholars such as Roy Wagner and Marilyn Strathern and on to Eduardo Viveros de Castro, who in turn passed it on to the recently much vaunted ontological turn, which stridently insists that social sciences has to be grounded in the concepts and understandings of the people it studies. The last theoretical motivation for Dumont's deployment of the holism individualism distinction is the one that may have been most personally meaningful for him and that may have the most resonance with the present moment. In 1987, the anthropologist Rodney Needham said bluntly what many others suspected, that Dumont himself was, quote, in favor of hierarchy and totality, and, quote, against egalitarianism and individualism. If I understand how one might come to that conclusion, I do not think it's right. Like his generation of French intellectuals in general, those who lived through World War II and the Vichy period as young adults, for Dumont, the question of how totalitarianism can come to dominate society is his ultimate, even if not his only, concern. In his later work, he finally answers this question by developing an account of what he calls pseudo-holism. In holism proper, elements of a social whole belong together because each has a role to play in sustaining that whole, even if these roles are of different values. In individualism, each person belongs to the society in which they exist because of their rights as persons. Pseudo-holism, Dumont proffers, arises when individualist societies try to recover holism. The only way an individual society can imagine a holism, he suggests, is as one where people belong together because they are substantially the same, not the same in their rights, but in their very being as members of a race or an ethnic, national, religious, or other kind of group that is imagined as homogeneous. For Dumont, then, totalitarianism and regimes that are akin to it arise from an attempt to return modern individual societies to a kind of mechanical solidarity that neither their state of differentiation nor their scale can achieve without force and efforts at purification that often take the form of expelling those who are thought to be different. I do not know enough about contemporary India to know if something like this might be going on, but sadly, I know enough about the contemporary United States to recognize that these dynamics are currently in play. The wager of my remarks has been that Dumont's work is hard to get past in the study of caste because, regardless of how much he may have gotten wrong, he is alive to some very big issues research in this area raises for our broader understanding of human societies. There seems to be some consensus among sociologists that Weber's account of the relationship between Protestantism and capitalism is open to a good deal of empirical challenge. Yet it remains the starting point for many discussions in sociology, history, and religious studies for reasons similarly related to the breadth and ambition of its project. As I've stressed all along, I'm in no position to guess what coming to a conclusion of this sort in relation to Dumont could mean for the study of caste going forward. But perhaps it might suggest that if it continues to be the case that Dumont's influence cannot be wholly shaken off, this might not in the end be such a bad thing after all. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Joel. It's really great set of comments there. And I'm just going to hand over to the next Joel yeah, your turn now. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm really very grateful to Manali and Just Meet and all the organizers of this really creative and exciting series. And it's also exciting to be in conversation with panelists whose work I've long admired. When I received the prompt for this conversation, I was immediately thrown back to a formative moment early in graduate school. I was taking an anthropology seminar called Ethnographies of South Asia, and the professor would sometimes give the class a hard time for being quick to jump on the latest theoretical trend and to dismiss previous generations of scholarship without having seriously engaged with them. This accusation was especially pointed when it came to Louis Dumont. Our professor observed that all of us in the class were acquainted with and indeed fond of repeating devastating criticisms of Dumont's approach to the study of caste, but how many of us, he asked, had actually read every page of Homo Hierarchicus, or for that matter, how many of us had read Dumont's serious ethnographic work, the 500-page A South Indian Subcaste, right, which is in many ways in tension with Homo Hierarchicus and is far more empirically based. So he assigned both in the same week, and earnest and chastised grad students that we were, many of us actually did read all of Homo Hierarchicus and all of the South Indian Subcaste and returned a week later haggard and underslept, but prepared to seriously discuss Dumont. We were astonished then when our professor strode into the next class and began lecturing on Thomas Hobbes and the Leviathan, and only realized several minutes into this that our professor, who was somewhat famously absent-minded, and I should add, who has a sense of humor about it and doesn't mind the story being repeated, had momentarily confused our class with his other class that semester, which was an undergraduate course on continental political theory. So I appreciate the topic and the framing that you all have prepared for this. What indeed is it in Dumont's work that makes it resurface time and again in the literature, despite 4 decades of accumulated critique? In a stimulating recent essay in the journal History and Anthropology, anthropologist Jayaseelan Raj offers one set of answers to this question that I think many people would be interested in here. Raj argues for, quote, the importance of Dumont's work for Dalit epistemology, since there are many similarities between the conceptualization of caste in the writings of Ambedkar and Dumont. He goes on to relate Ambedkar's, quote, elaboration of graded inequality with Dumont's argument on the encompassment of the contrary, end quote. The article goes on to make a number of really interesting suggestions for reading Dumont and Ambedkar together and for addressing the Dirksian critique that both are in the thrall of colonial representational practices. For my part, I thought it might be interesting to convey a thought on Dumont in a kind of roundabout fashion by sharing some notes from research I'm currently conducting on caste concealment. So I'll just gesture at a couple of stories that I'm working with in the book project that I'm working on now. The first, some of you may recall, depending on your attention to the media in Maharashtra in recent years, as it received some media coverage. So in September 2017, a case of alleged caste concealment erupted briefly but spectacularly into public view, first in newspaper headlines and next in street demonstrations in the city of Pune. Here is how the incident was reported in The Hindu, the newspaper. So I'll just read a substantial piece from The Hindu. A senior government scientist with the Indian Meteorological Department, IMD, has come under flack from activists and social activists in the city for lodging a case against her cook for allegedly impersonating as a Brahmin since May 2016 and lying about her caste. Dr. Medha Vinayak Kole, who is Deputy Director General for the IMD's weather forecasting station, sparked controversy with her complaint lodged against the cook, Nirmala Yadav, at the city's Sinhagad police station on Thursday evening. Police sources said that Dr. Kole filed a complaint after she discovered that the cook was not of the Brahmin caste, but belonged to the Maratha community, following the recently concluded Gauri Ganpati festival. The police said that Dr. Kole alleged in her complaint that Ms. Yadav had ostensibly concealed her caste to secure the job as she was under severe financial stress. But, according to Ms. Yadav, age 60, Ms. Kole had never asked her about her caste when she sought work with her in 2016. Quote, she, Kole, only asked my name when I went to work for her last year. It was only after Gauri Ganpati that she discovered I was Maratha and not Brahmin. Following this, she barged into my house and began assaulting me while stating that our God was of the streets while theirs was in the heaven. She also threw my mobile phone while abusing me, Ms. Yadav alleged. Dr. Kole, however, claimed that, quote, her religious sentiments were hurt, as she had wanted a married Brahmin woman to cook for family events such as the death anniversary of her parents and the Gauri Ganpati festival. She further claimed that she had paid Ms. Yadav wages amounting to rupees 20,000 since the past year. That's the end of that newspaper reportage. The conflict attracted intensive media attention, as some of you may recall. As a high-level government employee, Kole was criticized for betraying the values of secularity and caste neutrality formally espoused by the state. As a scientist, moreover, Kole defied stereotypes of who is a casteist. Other commentators, meanwhile, quote, faulted Nirmala Yadav for concealing her real identity, end quote, as two social scientists put it in a paper, and framed the dispute in terms of Kole's freedom of religion and right to regulate matters of hygiene in her own home. Caste associations quickly took positions. The Akhil Bharatiya Brahman Mahasangh extended support to Dr. Kole, while the Maratha organizations Shiv Sangram and the Shambhaji Brigade issued statements defending Ms. Yadav. The National Congress Party became involved, as did the Bajrang Dal, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, and left-leaning organizations. Then, after 3 weeks of lively protests, counter-protests, rallies, and media debate, the issue largely dropped out of the news cycle. In some ways, of course, the Kole case is highly exceptional. The publicity, the rallying of regional and national organizations behind a domestic cook. In other ways, the case is representative. It reveals what turns out to be one of the most ubiquitous sites of caste concealment in contemporary India: domestic labor in the advantaged caste home. This brings me to another story of a woman I call Rimpi, a domestic worker in Lucknow from the Valmiki community, a Dalit caste, but who assumes a backward caste persona in order to gain a non-Dalit backward caste persona in order to gain employment. So she's kind of at the heart of the one chapter of this story. So of this book. So I'll just quote briefly, but she has a lot of really insightful things to say. So when I ask Rimpi how she first found this position, she tells me, it's like this. I asked everyone, all my relatives. I said, I need work. I'm looking for work. Well, they all worked with their caste concealed. Jaat chupake kaam karti thi. In Prem Nagar, sectors 10 to 15. So it's all pseudonyms, even neighborhoods are pseudonyms, of course, for this line of work. I started working there. I got 2 houses, then 3 houses. My daughter was very little, 1 year old, as she was in my lap then. My eldest daughter was just 1 year old. I had to leave her at home to go to work. So I had these 3 houses. 2 worked out well because they never found out that I'm Valmiki. I told them I was Mali. I would hide caste and say that I'm Mali, the ones, who take care of plants and flowers. What, I asked, did her employers want to know when they hired her? Makan Malkin, the mistress of the house, asked, "Kaun jaat ki ho? What's your caste?" So I said, "I'm Mali." She said, "What does your husband do?" My husband, well, he worked at the university. He did gardening. Wo maligiri karte the. So I said, my husband does gardening at the university. That's how I started doing bartan chauka, as in that's how I started doing dishes work, which requires access to the kitchen in the Savarna home, right? And she goes on to explain how it's true that her husband worked as the maligiri, the work of gardening, right, is a form of labor, the central term of which also embeds a caste term, right? Mali, the caste, is supposed to be the person who does gardening. So the assumption follows that if her husband does maligiri, that they must be Mali. I asked how she chose to identify herself as Mali. She said, "If you say you're Balmiki, no one will employ you. No one will give you work. But if you say Mali, then everyone will give you work. Someone says Yadav, someone says Kurmi, someone else says Jat. All the Balmiki women who worked there in Premnagar, they all worked with caste, concealed. And these are, of course, different backward caste, but touchable caste categories that the women are assuming." And later in her narrative, there's a point when the woman who formerly worked in the home that she's currently working in returns from a long stint in the village and tries to get her job back, and she sort of tries to out Rimpi to the Makan Malkin. So she is overheard saying to the Makan Malkin, "Auntie Ji, you observe purity restrictions and you talk about being a pundit whose home is pure and who doesn't allow anyone to enter the kitchen without bathing first. But this woman you have working in your home is," and then she uses a caste epithet that's, really charged, but, a name for Rimpi's caste. So all of this is not a peculiarity of Lucknow any more than it is of Pune, as research on domestic work in other North Indian cities in recent decades demonstrates. A study of Savarna homes in Delhi finds that Muslim and Balmiki domestic workers are, quote, "not allowed to enter the kitchen of their employers and must request drinking water from intermediaries." The same obtains in Kanpur, where, quote, "to keep the food and kitchen pure, Dalits are never appointed for work in the kitchen," end quote. And this here I'm quoting a bunch of post 2000, last 2 decades studies on domestic labor by Freustadt, Sharma, Ray and Qayyum, Banerjee and Wilkes. There is evidence that spatial exclusion has increased and become more explicit since 2020. Quote, "employer reservations about Dalit and Muslim domestic workers, which had earlier been couched in the more socially acceptable language of hygiene, appear to have become more widespread with the pandemic," end quote, with householders becoming, quote, "more openly outspoken about such reservations," end quote. Consistent across studies in Delhi, Kanpur, and Kolkata is the finding that caste remains decisive in determining the distribution of tasks among domestic workers. So where cooks and childcare providers are recruited from non-Dalit families of low or middle caste origin, quote, "Dalit servants are employed as Dalits, i.e. for carrying out the specialization of their castes," and, quote, this one from Calcutta, "the bathroom cleaner is almost always exclusively that," end quote. So why turn to domestic labor practices and a discussion of Dumont? Dumont, as is well known, posited the opposition of purity and pollution as the structuring principle of caste qua system. In the many critiques of Dumont that have become perhaps canonical, the purity-pollution opposition has come to be treated as a kind of synecdoche for all that is ahistorical and inattentive to power in Dumont's structuralist account. The mode of analysis that in many ways has largely replaced this approach is one that begins and ends with the operations of the colonial and post-colonial state, its knowledge practices, classificatory regimes, the exercise of state power. But this approach has very little to offer when we look at what is happening in many spheres of current social life, like the domain of domestic labor, unregulated as it is by the state in any way. Studies of domestic labor practices point to the flourishing and not to the predicted or more often just presumed decline of the observance of caste orthopraxy in many Savarna homes. In 40 years of distancing itself from the conclusions of Dumont, anthropology, or at least some large swaths of it, has abandoned talk of purity and pollution as a kind of structuralist embarrassment, while in the actual labor arrangements that pervade corporate and governmental and privileged caste domestic structures in North India, and I'm thinking about, given my work, I'm particularly thinking about sanitation labor as a sector in new airports, in malls, and so on. Concern with these very principles and their direct mapping onto caste divisions continues to thrive and indeed to take on new forms. Medakole is no outlier or remnant in her preoccupation with ritual purity in the kitchen, but is diagnostic of a robust norm. So frameworks for analyzing caste that reduce it to an effective state power, like Caste of Mind, the book by Nicholas Dirks, can do many things, but cannot readily account for this norm. Dumont's approach, for its many problems, which are well known, does not fail to recognize the renewable vitality of the ideology of purity and pollution. This, I think, is one reason for his continuing appeal for many an anti-caste thinker. I have many other thoughts, but I'm sure we'll have a chance to come back to all this in discussion. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Joel. All right, I'll let Surinder speak now so that we can have some questions after that. Your turn.
Thank you so much, Manali and Jasmeet. Like Jules, I was also a little perplexed when I got this invitation, and I was kind of not very sure whether I should speak on Dumont, because and that will become very clear when I speak. When I had some discussion with Manali, and I was persuaded, and it's in some sense given me some chance to recollect my own, what I would like to call it, a reluctant engagement with Dumont. And as Joel Robbins and Joel said, both of them said that, it's hard to escape Dumont if you're a student of South Asia. And like other students, I was also introduced to Dumont while I was doing my master's in sociology. Before that, I used to be a student of economics. I didn't know much about caste system or Dumont or stuff like that. I remember it was in a classroom in Pune University where I was studying in a course on Indian society or on social stratification. I don't exactly remember that we had two detailed lecture on Dumont. And that was in early 1980s. If I remember very collectively, I was kind of, I had a bad taste in my mouth when I came out of the class. And this kind of has stayed with me and continues to stay with me. And this is what I'll try to present, that kind of standpoint, and not really try to persuade you that there is something interesting in Dumont. I had no personal contact with Dumont, though he kind of was around. I remember I never had the chance of listening to him. He, I think, did not come very much to India. So, he certainly did not inspire me. And I had already grown suspicious of the way Indian society was framed in sociology classroom. I had come from some kind of a political background, and I wanted to understand Indian society and the manner in which it was framed in 1980s, and to some extent even today, the way Indian society is taught in Indian sociology classrooms or anthropology classrooms remains kind of quite a problematic framing, and it's largely kind of seen as Hindu society and Hindu also in a particular manner. And Dumont seem to be kind of reinforcing that very clearly, that anthropology of India was anthropology of Hinduism, sociology of India was sociology of Hinduism, and Hinduism is what India was. Me being a Sikh and also having grown up in Punjab and Haryana, my in some sense response to it was very obvious. And Dumont's Hinduism was even more kind of problematic with me, because he places Brahmin at the center of Indian life or Hindu life. In Punjab and Haryana, where I grew up, and I had some first-hand experience. At that time, I had not done any studies of these regions empirically. There were Brahmins around, there were Pandits and there were Brahmins, but they were of very marginal concern. In rural Haryana, for example, Brahmins would be small cultivators. In Punjab, they were best seen as service providers who are ranked slightly above the Dalits. Nowhere have I saw Brahmin being either being a very respectable person. If there was a respectable Brahmin, he would invariably be a senior bureaucrat or something like that. Brahmin Pandit, particularly in Punjab, as Satish Sabharwal also writes at great detail, hardly had any sense of authority or dignity or anything like that. And I very consciously decided never to work on caste, and caste was at some level a kind of Brahminical conspiracy, which not only wanted us to study India, but also wanted us to accept a Hindu view of India. So my early work, when I did my PhD, it was on debt dependencies and agrarian change. I obviously was influenced by class framework of Karl Marx, and I tried to use it in my work, but obviously class framework also didn't work. But I was very sure that, caste was obviously of not much relevance. It was around, you could report caste as you talk about women, but you have to talk about agrarian authority and hierarchy. Then you have to focus on land. It was in the early 1990s that things began to change, and I was drawn to the reality of caste. And I think there are two things happen. My first job was in Gujarat, in Surat, but from there I moved to Hyderabad. And it was in 1990 that I got my first job. And I remember when I joined, I was kind of generally had disdain about caste. And then Mandal happened. And Mandal was a very important moment in contemporary Indian history. And when I went to Hyderabad, the two words that I heard most frequently in first several years, that was in 1991, but these two cases that had happened in Shunduru and Karamchedu. And these were both cases of really large-scale violence against Dalit, very brutal violence. And in response to that, human rights organizations had come up and they would talk about caste all the time. And that's the time when I kind of also thought that I should be working on caste. 8 years later, I left Hyderabad and came to North India. I joined first in Chandigarh. Right now, I'm sitting in Chandigarh. I came here today morning for a conference, and then to JNU. And then I thought, if I have to study caste, and if I think caste is relevant, then I should kind of talk about my context. And I remember in my childhood, caste was there. I mean, in my own home, I don't come from any marginalized caste group. We were kind of quite well off, even though my family was a family of migrants who had moved from Faisalabad or Lalpur district of Punjab to the Indian side of Punjab, which later on became Haryana. And I very clearly remember there used to be one old woman who would work in our house with my mother. I still remember her name was Fimo. And Fimo was like my grandmother, and I would really, all of us really loved her. And she had so much affection for us. But I remember my mother always kept separate vessels for her. She was from an untouchable caste. Now, when I think about it, I don't think she actually carried us, but she was there. She was very kind. She always had a smile on her face. Was Fimo a a Dalit? I think the answer is yes. Certainly, that's why she was considered as untouchable. There was another woman who would brought water for us from the local well, and she was also from another caste, but not a Dalit. So Fimo was certainly Dalit, but was she a Hindu, or was she Joy Lee's Lal Begi? I think she was closer to Lal Begi. Her name also suggests that it was not really a Hindu name. And in our locality, we also had a Panditji. And this Panditji was patronized by all of us, including my family. But he had very marginal role for our community. My mother was in some sense custodian of the local Gurudwara, which was in some sense which was kind of put together by our community in a mosque which had been abandoned by the Rangad Muslims who had been driven out of that place. And therefore we were very clearly not Brahmin was insignificant for us, but as a ritual, Brahmin would always be patronized, and there were some occasions where Brahmin was given some food or some money, but he was a very humble man, very poor, very marginal to the everyday life of the community. So this is what I had grown up with, the idea of Brahmin and Dalit on both sides. And we were considered as the not exactly the dominant caste in the manner in which Aman Shirin was called, but I would call as kind of upper caste. So my initial engagement with caste when I started working on caste empirically was a survey of caste and untouchability in rural Punjab. It was a survey of 51 villages. Then I also studied my own villages where I had done my field work, which were in Haryana, and I looked at caste and revisited them after 20 years. I've also worked in Himachal Pradesh and Bihar, and to some extent also in Delhi and Saharanpur in UP. So these are kind of, all of them are North Indian or Northwestern Indian kind of sites. And when I started working on it, I reread Dumont. I mean, at that time, my teachers were not as demanding as Joel's teachers were. But later on, when I started working on it, I remember I read every page of Louis Dumont's Homo Hierarchicus, and it still failed to inspire me. Why did it fail to inspire me? Actually, I was perhaps a little more irritated with Dumont when I read Homo Hierarchicus very clearly. And the point that Dumont emphasizes, and this has also come out at some level in the early two presentation, that caste is about Hinduism, India is about Hinduism, Hinduism is about India, and everything that exists in India is Hindu, everything that exists in Hinduism is India, and this overlap is something that really is very, very problematic for me. And second, about question of power and status, by the time I began to work on caste, the questions that were articulated in the post-1990s India were about caste as exclusion, caste question as being a citizenship question, not as question of pollution and status. Caste was about violence, caste was about humiliation. So does Dumont theory help me to understand or unfold structures of humiliation, structures of violence that to me caste in some sense reinforced? My own reading did not suggest that Dumont was of any helpful. At best, Dumont is very, very uncritical of pollution. Pollution as an ideological system exists, but what does it produce? What are the outcomes of pollution? The outcome of pollution is hierarchy, of course, but hierarchy is not Dumont's invention. This was already there. Pollution is also not Dumont's invention. Pollution was there, but pollution produces dehumanization. Pollution produces, in some sense, alienation from the larger world. And Dumont, for me, was certainly not conceptually compelling. In some sense, it also produced a kind of a neo-nationalist view of India, which in some sense works very well with the idea of unity in diversity, which was propagated by nationalism. And this is something that I'll come back to in a short while. So it in some sense also presents a Brahmin-centric view of India, where Brahmin becomes the most important person or figure or category in the Indian imagination, theoretically and socially and empirically. And this in some sense also, I would say, remains a central understanding in the Western sociological imagination of India, that India is a different place. India is an exceptional place, and its exceptionalism lies in the fact that because India has caste system, and this caste system is unique to India, it is about Hinduism, and it is an ancient system which has continued to be more or less similar for the past, as Dumont says, 7th century or 5th century before Christ was born. Hindus invented this. Again, when I started empirically working on caste, and it was very clear to me that it was possible to work on caste without really centering Dumont. That doesn't mean that caste is not class. I mean, I recently written a paper in EPW on futures of caste where I've talked about materialities of caste, and many people have reacted that the moment you use the word materiality, that means you're saying caste is class. Actually, the starting point is that one has to recognize the fact that caste is not class. But caste, when it survives today and it works in everyday life, it does not work as system of purity and pollution all the time. Purity and pollution are also cultural processes which are essentially power processes. They are not separate from power. And Dumont, though, talks about his notion of purity and pollution being a Weberian ideal type. But for Weber, status is a dimension of power. Status is not outside power. And I've actually used a Weberian idea of ethnicity in my book on caste in contemporary India to talk about caste. And Weber has a very interesting discussion on how ethnic groups can emerge as kind of bounded within, and they produce a structure of hierarchy. And this structure of hierarchy is a structure of power relations, structure of domination, structure of subordination. So it is in this context that I would say that, you know, what keeps Dumont going, because he produces a kind of imagination of India which goes along very well with nationalist imaginations of India. And nationalist imagination of India would like to think of India as a singular cultural system which is inherently united, which is essentially Hindu, and to which everyone subscribes. I think Joel's work, I really enjoyed reading his book, but that makes precisely the point that this is untrue. This is deceptive. This is deceptive because so-called Dalits or Lal Begis who have local names in North India, Valmiki is a word was given to them by the Hindu Mahasabha in early 20th century. But otherwise, they are closer to Sufi Islam, as Joel very, very interestingly shows in his work, than to Hinduism. Right? So there are different ways in which Varna hierarchy is structured. I mean, Varna itself is a category of very little value. You can't find Varna anywhere. Are Brahmine Varna? My answer empirically is absolutely not. Every Brahmin, and there are different kinds of Brahmin. Today I was talking to somebody here who is studying Gautam Brahmins of Mathura, and there are some new Brahmins who were earlier perhaps an OBC or a low caste, and they got into priestly occupation, and now they are claiming Brahmin status. Other Brahmins don't want to marry them, but they say they are Brahmins. So Brahminness is also being produced in the 21st century and late 20th century. Before that, they were not Brahmins. It's like Baniyas of Bihar. They are Telis, and now they are saying they are Baniyas, but they are listed as OBCs. So these identities are being produced, and I would say that there are different structures of hierarchy. There's not a singular structures of hierarchy where Brahmin is at the top and other communities follow. And empirical research, again, without empirical research, you can't have castes. Just by modeling, you can't have caste. I think there is a Jat structure of hierarchy. When MacLeod was studying Punjab and Sikh society, he immediately said there are two hierarchies in Punjab. There's a rural hierarchy and there is urban hierarchy. In rural Punjab, Jat Sikh is at the top, followed by other castes. In urban Punjab, Khatri is at the top, followed by other communities. In none of the hierarchies, Brahmin is anywhere in the top 2 or 3 communities. There are other communities, but Brahmin is not really, not that Brahmins are not there in Punjab. Punjab has had Brahmins, Haryana has Brahmins, but Brahmins are small cultivators. So there is a rural hierarchy of caste. There is an urban hierarchy of caste in Northwest India. There is a Jat hierarchy of caste. There is Rajput hierarchy of caste. If you go to Rajasthan, status goes with authority and power. So even within Himachal Pradesh, there are 2 regions. I studied, and this paper came out in EPW, Caste on the Hill. If you go to Kullu region or Mandi region, this is the Rajput region. They have local devatas, which are totem devatas. All devatas are also Rajputs. And they report to a Rajput in Mandi town in Kullu. When you have Kullu Dashera, all the devatas congregate there because the Kullu Raja, Rajput, is their topmost authority at the district level. So the Shaivite Hinduism in Kullu region has no role for Brahmin. It's the Rajput that is also the religious authority, and religious structure is embedded into the power structure. And this is theoretically a very important challenge that Dumont doesn't want to engage with. So likewise, you have other communities, and caste continues to be a very diverse system. And historically also, it has always been diverse. And this Varna model is purely an Orientalist, logical, textual construct, as Srinivas rightly called as a book view of India. But Srinivas, going back to Joel's Robbins' work, I was also teaching Sanskritization. Why does he use Sanskritization? Because he wants to work on Rampura. Srinivas is also embedded in the nationalist, Orientalist imagination of India, where he goes to Rampura via Mysore and prefers to name the village as Rampura. But when he goes to the village, the first thing is he encounters is a dominant caste. Caste and dominance go together. They are not separate. So you find these very interesting kind of problems. In my last point, is it possible to study caste without Dumont? The answer is yes. As I said, the idea of pollution is not Dumont's discovery. It was already there, and it is not very difficult to. Pollution remains very, very critical. And I think historical scholarship on caste has shown how useless is a wrong word to use, but Dumont is very, very problematic, because caste has always been a dynamic process. If you read David Ludden's work on North Indian agrarian life, it's the 13th, 14th century that Jats migrate from Rajasthan upwards to Punjab and Haryana, and these regions are transformed by Jats. What does Islam do? Islam is not an alien religion. Islam is an Indian religion. Islam comes to India when Muhammad is still alive. And if you were to go to Malabar region of Kerala, you have Maplas, and Maplas are Maplas. You can't say that Maplas are results of colonial Mughal colonization. So these are very interesting and important elements of Indian culture, Indian life, Indian history. And you cannot think about India without thinking about Maplas as being very core of India, as very real reality of India. And when you think of Brahminic Hinduism as the only kind of Hinduism, in my Sikhism also, caste is first thing that you encounter. So if I have to look at agrarian processes, caste is very central. But you can't really use Dumontian notion of caste and talk about landlessness in Punjab and Haryana. It was because of the colonial policies. Land was given only to specific communities, and other communities were kept as landless. And that is very, very important element. Corporate hiring, why caste gets becomes a very important source of soft capital, because of certain other attributes which are materialities of caste. And those materialities of caste come through those kind of caste habituses, which are middle class, urban, quote unquote, modern, very modern habituses. And it is in this context that one should also think of caste as a comparative construct through which we can study American society. Caste is not an Indian word. To begin with, caste was a European word, West European word, and it would have referred to some social structure in West Europe. We have Zat, we have Jati, but Zat is not just Jati, Zat is not just Varna. Zat could also come from the word Izzat, and Izzat is an Arabic word, and Izzat means honor. So one can have different interpretations of the term Zat, but Zat in Punjab of 19th century or of 21st century, these are very different kinds of the dynamics. Zat Biradari or the Bhadraloks of Calcutta again would present a very different kind of dynamics. Or if you go to the Nair localities in Kerala, these are very different kinds of social realities. So there's no point in having a unified theory which provides us a very simple solution. And Dalit, middle class Dalit love it, because they are also invested in the nationalist imagination of singular Brahmin-centric India, because that reinforces their theorization. I've had these debates in my own university after this article that you are not really talking about hierarchy. It is about hierarchy. It is about pollution. But hierarchy, pollution, caste, they are also power relationships. They are dimensions of power. They produce exclusion. They produce humiliation. They produce effects which are directly power effects. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. Yes, thanks so much. This has been a very stimulating set of discussions for all three of you. Thank you for this, because what's also emerging are, three clearly differentiated and very compelling, reflections. I was wondering, as our speaker, our audience, if you would like to start putting your questions in the chat, but I would actually like to offer Joel, the two Joels, literally a minute, no more than a minute and a half, a minute plus, a little bit. If you would like to come back and just reflect on what you've heard so far from the other two speakers. So is there anything you would like to add? But I would really like to obviously give the audience a bit of time to get their questions coming in. Anyone want to go first?
I don't
You don't
think
have
I
to.
have a question. Yeah. I mean, I really enjoyed both presentations. I'm still digesting them. So,
Okay. Joel, did you want to say anything or?
No, I also really appreciate all the sort of material in the air, and
Yeah.
look forward to sort of getting some questions from the audience and from you, and
Yeah.
to see where it goes. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm happy to kick off with the question, but I don't know, just meet you. Did you want to, did you want to ask a question first while we get the audience?
So
Is
one thing,
anything-
thank you, Manali. One thing that we have been discussing consistently in our readings is about this question of persistence and transformation of caste. So would you like to just reflect on it via the Dumontian lens or not, considering what keeps the system just multiply and transform, and then we find ways to theorize, and then it skips our hand again and it goes to Silicon Valley, and then so on and so forth, right? It keeps multiplying. So what is it that is that essence that makes caste keep sort of going in that fashion?
Surinder.
Uh, See, Dumont has a theory of what one should say modernity of caste, when he says there would be shift from structure to substance, what we call as substantialization of caste. And this is something with which I again disagree with Dumont. There is, to some extent, this is an interesting formulation that, and my friend and colleague Dipankar Gupta actually uses this when he talks about caste exists as identities, but it doesn't exist as hierarchy. And I completely disagree with that position. Caste continues to exist as hierarchy. It continues to persist precisely because caste is a very important indicator of inequalities in India. And I'm not talking about ritual inequalities. Most people don't care about ritual inequalities any longer. In Punjab, if you go to a village Punjab, nobody practices untouchability in the manner in which it was practiced earlier, but there is still a sense of humiliation that gets reinforced because Dalit kids are unable to go to urban schools. So there are structures of inequalities which are being at some level, if you look at last 25, 30 years post neoliberal reforms, those structures of inequality have become much greater. And this is something that there are a couple of essays in our handbook of caste, which OUP published last year, actually shows that how for most communities, caste has now become the only source of insurance. And in small towns, there is revival of caste associations. People used to talk about caste associations in early 20th century, but in last 20 years, there's increasing tendency among all kinds of caste groups to come together as caste association. There's somebody to go to because you don't have jobs, you don't have other securities, and fragmentation is increasing in society. But now, are these formations substantialized castes? I think it is not, because they again, then there is also a new word that is used for these groupings that they call themselves as Samaj. Bal Murali's work on Samajification of caste. So they are all Samaj. So internally, they don't identify themselves as caste groups. They would say these are associational formations. And associations are voluntary. Associations are not really. But are these substantialized caste? Even Dumont perhaps would not agree. Because these are, again, the difference lies in their resources. So when Valmikis get together and form an association, the kind of resources they have are very limited. The only thing they're interested in, again, Joel's work shows, is somehow to be able to get into the Sarkari job, to have some regular jobs which are not there any longer. For Valmikis also, they are also contractualized. And your own work in that Rajasthan city shows how these differences are actually also structures of inequalities in urban India. And reproduction of caste since the early 20th century and much more vigorously in the last 30 years, the site of its reproduction is not the village. The site of its reproduction is the city. And the site of its reproduction is the middle class aspiration rather than status hierarchy and pollution. It's job. It is somehow trying to find some kind of economic and social security in a world which is increasingly getting more and more fragmented.
Can I just throw in oh, sorry, Joel, did you want to respond? I just had a question, but sorry, I should say Joel Lee or Joel. I think Joel. I thought you wanted to say something, but.
Yeah, I mean, just Surinderji's remarks make me think of you know how a close reading of Dumont, you can sort of, he provides you the material to argue against himself, right? So there's this line that nobody seems to notice on page 82 of Homo Hierarchicus, where he writes, in the neighboring district of Tinnevelly, I saw the marks of blows on the back of an untouchable, blows which he had received for having crossed the village of a martial caste, the Maravar, wearing sandals. And I mean, you can certainly see in the kind of empirical work that he does how the kind of analytical distinction between the principle of hierarchy and its animating element of this purity pollution axis opposition, analytically distinguishable from the exercise of force, is in fact, how these work together in practice in all the time, as a kind of, constant social fact. So I think in some ways the kind of dead end that we sometimes get into is running with that distinction. I mean, I feel like the kind of the kind of Dirksian consensus, if you want to put it that way, post Dumont is still holds this idea that, okay, well, if we're going to abandon purity and pollution, then it's all going to be power, and we're going to sort of, as though the exercise of power doesn't constantly use and revitalize the idiom of purity and pollution, as though this ideology is not a constantly renewable resource for the maintaining of various kinds of monopolies on resources, as you say, but this ideology and the purity and pollution never goes away, and so you have ever new kind of forms of the Kaveri Gill's wonderful book of poverty and plastic, right, on the plastic recycling industry. All kinds of new materials come into play, and and with that new material, new fissions of castes are produced over what is more wet material and what is more dry material, and so that kind of segmentation of the caste that Dumont points to, based on this kind of, what is the more impure material, what is the less polluted material, right? Suddenly you get new divisions among castes based on who's recycling what materials. So I mean, just the kind of artificial division of the question of power from the question of purity and pollution, I think has misled so much, and to bring the two together is sort of more helpful, I think, in some ways.
Just come in for a minute, just for a minute.
Very quickly, because there are actually some questions, and I have a question. Suddenly the questions are pouring in, yeah.
So, Joel, for Dumont, the question is not that purity and pollution exists as ideology. For him, the central question, when if you read his essay on hierarchy towards the end, it's the unity of encompassed and encompassing. And if you bring that in the center, then the scope of this discussion is not there in Dumont. Sorry.
Thank you. I'm just going to exercise chair's privilege and ask a question, and then I'll move on. There are about 4 or 5 questions already, very quick, and it's just an observation, because we haven't actually touched upon 2 vital aspects of this purity pollution dynamic, which is endogamy and sort of beti vyavhar and roti vyavhar, the sort of who you can eat with and who you can share food with and who you can't. And this seems to be so persistent across the entire spectrum of the caste system that it actually cuts across what we think of as self-evident castes. Among Dalits, for example, there are multiple gradations and differentiations of this kind. Now, this to me also speaks somewhat critically to Surinder's. I appreciate and I share with you concern about Indian exceptionalism. But on the other hand, we don't want to go to the other side and not be able to appreciate the unique sort of historical emergence of these dynamics and these structures and reduce them to a singular model of power or, whatever. So I think we have a tension here that we need to address, which is to attend to these completely, in my view, very highly specific modalities of the working of a system of what you call ethnicity through an enduring principle that's organized around pollution and purity in many aspects of life, just as Joel Lee has articulated, but also Joel Joel Robbins was also attempting to suggest. And finally, my other question is, do we need empirically or the personhood of the Brahmin to appreciate the symbolic importance of Brahminical power? And I think there's a confusion between the two. Just to say there are not many Brahmins is not helpful, or, it doesn't help us appreciate the symbolic power of a Brahminical authority and the idea that actually this is an aspirational or a kind of organizing principle. And so I'll just leave it at that. Should I just read out some of the other questions and we can come back to this later? Because I'm worried that we'll get sort of sidetracked. Or did you want to come back? Joel, you look like you want to say something. Joel Lee. No. Okay, you perpetually look like you want to say something. So it's good. But I'll just read out some of the questions and then maybe we can take them in a sort of gathered field. So I'm not necessarily reading them in the order in which they were written. But I mean, there is one question for Surinder, which is, how do you understand caste as both a power relation and an ethnically bounded community? And could you please elaborate on this in terms of the methodological approach to studying it? So I'm just going to put that question to you and then turn to some of the other questions.
Thank you. I think this question can be answered along with your first question about endogamy and food. And I think for both these questions, conceptual answer lies in Max Weber. And this is something that I've discussed with Max Weber has very elaborate discussion about ethnicity is not simply about horizontal differences, or ethnicity is also about enclosures, about other kind of enclosed classes, as the word that he uses. And I think that's where the answer lies. Dumont certainly does not provide answer to us. So you have this differentiation being reproduced. I completely agree with you. I mean, it doesn't mean that the endogamy is explainable without referring to anything. And the question about food, but again, this is not something which is exceptional to India. And I think these kinds of boundaries have existed in other cultures, and elite cultures or social milieus do reproduce those kinds of differences in other contexts as well, race being the obvious one, but also things like social milieu in German context. But many other societies would have those ethnic formations which are enclosed groupings, and we have literature that is coming out on discrimination globally, which is talking about these things, which is talking about how discrimination is not simply a kind of personalized attribute or personalized prejudice. It also has identity dimension. Gender is also a kind of identity-based difference, and that at some level kind of then also produces other problems. Food obviously is a very, very critical subject, and also my take on that would be that one needs to empirically engage with the changing practices of food. With, for example, new food cultures coming into Indian urban life, Zomato or the Sky Kitchens as they're called, how is food distinction being reproduced? Is it there any longer, or has it gone away? And I think this is a question, is a good empirical question to ask what time is doing, what new liberal urban middle class mobilities are doing to food. And I think for For the power and ethnicity questions, the answer lies in Weber, not in Dumont. And I'll stop here. The other question is much more challenging, what you're talking about, personhood of Brahmin versus Brahminical authority. I think that is something that we need to think about it. But are there other ways of thinking about it other than Dumont?
Thanks, that's great. Anybody else want to jump in, or I can, yes, Joel Lee.
Oh, just very briefly, since it relates closely to the question you just asked about food and the kind of empirical study of food practices. There's a wonderful, this book just came out, Caste in Everyday Life, Experience and Affect in Indian Society, Dinesh Verboy, Hugo Boring. And it contains an essay called Brahmin's Touch in Digital Branding, Food, Taste, and Identity, which is a kind of study of a very successful digital, virtual marketplace, kind of digital branding ingredients company based in Kerala called Brahmin's Foods. Hugely successful. So Rohini Sri Kumar and Amrita Mohan Kumar addresses this quite squarely very recently.
Thanks, it's really helpful. I'm going to read out another couple of questions. So there's one question about whether the theoretical turn towards understanding caste as racialization does that allow us to study persistence and reproduction through its materiality? Does anybody want to take that question?
It was about racialization.
Caste, thinking about caste as racialization. I'm assuming the question is really thinking about the literature that sort of connects caste and race. How productive is that for helping us understand its persistence?
Durban Conference and post-Durban Conference, the manner in which caste comes to be articulated, in some sense, I'm also influenced by that. So people who are saying that caste should be treated like race, they are not saying that caste is race. And I think this was a misconception. Lots of sociologists kind of took it and unnecessarily tried arguing it, because race is also, like Gail Ombed said, race is also a construct. Race is not an empirical reality, and caste is also a construct, and these are culturally specific. But I think the point that came out of it and post Durban Conference, and I was also associated with the Indian Institute of Dalit Studies, where caste began to be studied as site of discrimination by economists. Before that, economists never studied caste. And I think labor market becomes very important site where inequality and reproduction of inequality began to be engaged with empirically. And I was part of some of those studies. That book came out, edited by Mr. Thorat and Newman on Block by Caste, which in some sense also had inspiration from the American kind of literature on discrimination, which is again very neoclassical. It's not a very radical literature, but there was this what was it called? The word is taste for discrimination, and this is something that economists began to operationalize, with the race becoming a kind of comparative model available to them. I know Professor Thorat went and read all the literature, American literature on discrimination, labor market discrimination, and began to apply on the labor market structuring of India. And this was a new literature on caste, which did not exist earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I find obviously the conversation between very old conversation, right? I mean, going back to Ambedkar and Du Bois, and then, a century earlier with Phule and his dedication of Ghulamgiri in the fashion that he did, and this kind of long tradition of conceptual borrowing across these contexts has been very productive. Yeah, I think it does a lot of good things. I think sometimes though there may be the temptation to kind of just import wholesale a kind of theoretical apparatus from elsewhere, and that can kind of overwhelm. If we lose attention to the empirical specificity of what's going on in both places, that's something to sort of caution against, and to really think and to also think with local categories, I think is really important, because yeah, I mean, the comparison that's sometimes made between racial passing in the US and Jat Chupake Rehna or living with caste concealed in India, it's a productive conversation, but the temptation is to sort of just, wholesale import the idea of passing and call it caste passing and think we understand then what it is. But actually, if you look at the practices, ways of thinking about it, the everyday life of it, it's actually quite different. So I think it's worth, just proceeding with caution.
Thank you. I'm aware that there are some questions that are very specifically about caste, and I just wondered whether, Joel, Joel Robbins, I mean, if you had any kind of thoughts, that you'd like to share with us, listening to the conversation so far. I mean, there's no pressure, but if you think there's something you'd like to jump in with, just let me know.
Yeah, no, I'm really just enjoying listening, and I'm learning a lot. So I think I'll if I do have something, I'll let you know. But
Okay.
I'm very content to just hear what people who know what they're talking about have to say.
That's great. Thank you. That's wonderful. So I will just turn to another question. This is asking, I wonder how Dumont could be read alongside an empirical study of Brahmin castes. So what happens when Dumont's Brahmin-centric findings about the purity pollution axis are found to operate amongst this privileged minority? My doctoral study of the making of Tamil Brahmin womanhood shows women's central role in reproducing the Brahmin identity, even as they are constituted in its margins. Their roles include maintaining ritual purity in creative ways amidst migration to urban and international destinations. And that's connected to another question about, I would just throw that in as well, about the internationalization of caste, of Indian caste. So the second question is really, does the internationalization of Indian caste challenge Dumont's India essentialism? I think these things could be taken as a pair, if anyone wants to jump in.
Again, I'll have to come in, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, these are very interesting questions. I think these are very interesting empirical questions, and I think they need to be engaged with empirically. I think, fortunately, now for last 10, 15 years, people have begun to work on the other side of caste also. I think earlier, post 90s, everybody was working on Dalit, and then OBC and Dalit, caste and marginal process. And I think it's very good that caste is also being worked on as privilege. And there are some studies already available, and they're very interesting studies. But the moment you frame it as caste, the privileged side of caste, and as we are doing it, we are already shifting away from Dumont. And I think we are shifting into kind of my kind of framework. We are looking at this reproduction of Brahmin identity as a resource which has a market value. And same applies to, again, Ajanta Subramanian's work on, to which Manali was talking about. The real thing is not about pollution. Real thing is who is going to inherit the social and cultural capital of Brahmin IIT graduate in California. It should not go to someone coming from another community, another caste, with whom we don't feel comfortable. My own work on corporate hiring very clearly showed that people wanted to have people who are like them. They're not necessarily looking for a person of their caste, but they're looking for people of their caste cohorts, which would include Khatris of Punjab, along with Brahmins of South India, perhaps also, Bhadraloks of Bengal. They can all form one cohort. They are similar, but they're very different in terms of their ethnic life. So I think this also opens up new sets of questions. One can read Dumont, of course, one should. There's no problem with that, because this whole question of pollution and hierarchy, one needs to engage with. But Dumont has a very specific notion of hierarchy. Dumont is not saying, he says hierarchy is not about power. And this is a claim that he's making very, very strongly, that hierarchy is not about power. Hierarchy is about unity. He gives the example of Adam and Eve, how Adam encompasses Eve, and he actually refers to that. Modern feminists might think of this as power relationship, but this is the relationship between encompassed and encompassing. So his notion of hierarchy has no place for discussion of critical issues of distribution, of authority, of power, of exclusion, of reproduction of identities in the context of emerging neoliberal market economy. So that is why I've been kind of being so strong on this.
Any other comments or thoughts on that? Okay. Thank you. So let me see if there's some other questions here. So there is a question about, once again, I think this is about, the question is, in some states in India, Brahmins are not at the highest position, then why is the Brahminical social system always being reproduced? Or Brahminical power. I know Surinder is doing is having to answer a lot of these questions, but yeah, they seem to be arising out of your presentation. So
yeah, I mean, see, when people were talking about Sanskritization from within anthropology, there was also a debate, and many people were saying that the reference group caste is not the Brahmins for most cases of what Srinivas would call as Sanskritization. It is actually the castes other than Brahmins. And many people actually argued that we should call it Kshatriyization. But Kshatriya is also not really a category, like Brahmin is not really a substantive category. You have jatis, you have Brahmin regional formations. You can use the word Brahmin as Varna, but in reality, say, for example, lower OBCs, many sections of lower OBCs in my area, Jimmer, for example, all of them would say we are Rajputs. No one will claim Brahmin as the status they want to. They don't want to become Brahmins. So that is not really the enviable caste group. So point I'm trying to make, and this goes also back to Manali, your question. So this Brahminical authority is also a process of Dumontian naming or Orientalist naming of caste system. And it becomes the normal way of looking at caste as a Brahminical system. But this naming comes to us from Indological and Orientalist writings by the West, which are reading selective texts through Brahmin interlocutors. But you have authority. Brahmins have also not really been ritual authority. Brahmins have been rulers. Brahmins in some areas, Peshwas are Brahmins, So you have these Rajputs and Brahmins are also fighting with each other for state power. So the actual history of caste is not a singular history of caste. Actual history of caste is a multiple history of caste. In Punjab, nobody would want to be Brahmin, and nobody talks about Brahminical authority. Even those who want to talk about, Hindu caste system, they would also put Jat Sikh at the center. And nobody wants to become Brahmin. So, so this is a little more complicated. That's what I'm saying, that, this one needs to also recognize the difference, I think.
Yeah, I mean the regional specificity is key, right? The regional and historical specificity, and Dumont and Dirks both did fieldwork in kind of highland Tamil Nadu with these communities that were sort of in some ways delinked from direct Brahminical authority as such, and yet were engaged in the kind of idiom that that the Brahminical structure makes available. I guess the kind of move toward power-centered paradigms has become in some ways so entrenched, and sort of state-centered paradigms has become so entrenched that it's become sort of surprising when in places like Lucknow or Pune, or it's surprising to an academic crowd, right, that in fact to be Dvivedi or to be is the prestige accorded, the enduring and in fact renewable capital that becomes available with certain kinds of Brahminical names is really quite remarkable. So Yes, I mean I think it's interesting also to note that Ajanta Subramanian's book, for example, or David Moss's recent work, that some of the and for that matter, this volume that's just come out, Caste in Everyday Life, a lot of the new work that's coming out, that's very attentive to the experience of caste in everyday life and the reproduction of uh, monopolies of resources, takes Bourdieu and Ambedkar as its sort of theoretical light, and in a way that in a way that raises interesting questions. I mean, partly it's about, some of these studies are focused on education, for example, the IITs and so on, and so it makes sense you would go to Bourdieu. But I think there's more there as well, in thinking about a paradigm for thinking about the reproduction of power that is not entirely state-centric, right? That is compatible with thinking about the state, but is also, thinking about patriarchal authority and more traditional forms of authority, right? The kind of the ways that Bourdieu thinks about social and cultural capital are much more supple in that sense. They don't fall for the sort of trap that Dumont and Dirks have set up for us of either or.
Sorry,
The idea of
oh,
power is, I think, very useful category, embodied power, which kind of, when you go to the selection panel for a corporate job, what they look for is soft capital. I think that the soft skills, and everyone talks about soft skills. One of my students has done a PhD on IIM Calcutta, and soft skilling happens in parties, and that becomes the most critical resource for mobility and getting very high value jobs.
I think Manali had a problem with seeing the questions, so I'm going to read a couple of questions from the Q&A. So one question is by Mayur Hilia, and he asks, how do you look at caste as a model of surveillance by state and society in contemporary times, in rural and more important urban areas, especially linking caste-based occupations like sanitation work and keeping Dalits in their places? And this is a question directed to Joel Lee.
Sorry, I missed a key word in the first sentence.
So
Could you
caste
just
as a
repeat it?
Right. So caste is a mode of surveillance by state and society, both in rural and urban areas, particularly looking at sanitation work, jobs, and the idea of keeping Dalits in their places.
Yeah, caste as a mode of surveillance. Yes, indeed. I mean, the sanitation work, of course, with its kind of inescapable and sort of excruciating visibility, right, is central. There's a lot one could say about that, about sort of sanitation labor and surveillance. I mean, of course, just in kind of an operational, everyday sense, right? I mean, the structure of that form of labor, which is huge. I mean, in terms of a scale, a domain of work, right? The numbers of people employed as street sweepers and drain cleaners and other, jalads is another category, those who remove dead animals from public space and so on. Right, this enormous workforce that has been kind of reproduced in corporate settings as well, with interestingly, very little shift in who is being recruited. In various kinds of institutions, and of course in domestic, in private companies, and then in domestic spaces. All of this is very heavily surveilled work. To think about caste as a mode of surveillance, yeah, it's a very interesting suggestion that I appreciate. I'll think on that.
There's one more question from Vishal So Vishal is asking to all the three panelists, how do we understand victimization and claiming victimhood as a means to hold on to power and status from a Dumontian lens? So perhaps Joel Robbins, if you have something to say, and then the other panelists could take that up. So the question is on victimization and victimhood and relation to power and status of Dumont.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think a lot of the critique of Dumont is that probably victimization was not a concept in his vocabulary particularly, or something that he was looking at, which I think is also why Surinder talks a lot about humiliation, which I think is very important as a social phenomenon in general, not just in the caste system. So I'm not sure how he would answer the question. I guess I think if one's interested in interpreting Dumont, which one doesn't have to be, you have to ask why would he make that distinction? There's a lot of evidence that he wasn't an imbecile, that he wasn't completely blind to the realities of social life. So I guess I would ask what that distinction does for him, and then I would ask how that might help you think about how that power status differentiation could be related to victimization. I think maybe I know that's not a full answer, but yeah. Thanks.
I think I'm back in, so I can see some questions. I just couldn't see the older questions after I got booted out. So there is one question, I'm afraid, again for Professor Jodhka. How do you define the term Dalits, and what is the status quo of ex-untouchables in Sikhism, particularly in terms of ritual authority? It's quite a sort of empirical and conceptual question.
Thank you very much. I think at some level it's also linked to the earlier question. If you were to look at from Dumont's perspective, the earlier question, the idea of pollution, the question of victimhood, Dumont is taking us away from this narrative of power, and he says that there is something very exceptional. That's why the term Indian exceptionalism becomes very critical, exceptional to India and Hindus. And he says that we tend to look at India from our modern minds. And the word modern mind comes again and again in his work. That modern is Western, Western is about power, Western is about victimhood, Western is about inequality of political economy. India is exceptional because hierarchy is not power. So there are no victims in India. There are no marginals in India. India is a united force, dialectical unity of purity and pollution. The person who is polluted is also equally invested in the system, because that is what India is, and that's what is interesting about India for him, that if Western mind should look at India as a totally different kind of thing, not compare with itself. And I think the question of Dalit takes us to whole questions of looking at caste historically. And unless one looks at caste historically, and this is linked to a question of Sikh religion, now this whole thing about caste being a Hindu religious system is also very problematic, because caste is also a social and economic system. It has always been. Caste has also been about, like Ambedkar would say, rural settlements were caste because there were two different villages and Dalits lived away from. So caste has always been an exclusionary system, and a system that excludes. But the term Dalit, in order to do that, we'll have to look at the colonial history of caste, what colonial governance does to caste, enumeration does to caste. And that is when you have listing of, in 1920s, you have this person, what is his name, Simon Charsley's work, how the idea of pollution line is actually invented in 1920s. And once you have the pollution line, then the listing becomes a very interesting kind of process. And then the British bring in their own welfareism, because that's also something through which they legitimize their rule over India. And so they begin to classify caste groups when colonial census in some sense becomes institutionalized as backward classes, and you need quotas for backward classes. Local states were doing it. The idea of pollution line did not come in the colonial governance. It came actually from the local rulers, as Simon Charlesley tells us. So it is in this history of listing communities as deprived and needing affirmation that a new imagination of caste begins to emerge, that there are people who are on the margin, they are victims, and there are people who are privileged. But this, in some sense, takes us away from Dumont's framework. Power becomes central. Who is going to give that recognition? So Dalit is a term which, in some sense, is the term of modern times, when modernity becomes a source of mobilization for people on the margins. And it is through the modernity language, the invoke idea of Dalitness, that we are at the receiving end of caste system. We are not really, in some sense, embedded in the Hindu system. Ambedkar, that's why, tries to convince people of his caste or his communities that they are not Hindus and they don't get anything from Hinduism. He actually keeps using the word minority, minority, and then eventually he has to kind of move out of Hinduism formally, right? So I think that's where the word Dalit has a very interesting kind of political and historical context. And I would say that Dalit is a modern term, is a term which is invoked in relation to modern state through social movements against untouchability. Dalitness is not simply describing yourself differently. Dalitness is also making claim over modern citizenship of the state, of the nation state, and equal rights. And in the Sikhism, in the Sikh context, again, it's not very difficult for me. The moment you take out the Brahmin as the central point about caste exists among Sikhism. And the fact that even in the 16th century, you have protest against caste system. Nanak starts by questioning the legitimacy of caste system. Later, Guru say, Manas ki jaat sab ek hai pehchan bo. Recognize that humanity has one caste. So I think these are very important moments in Indian history, which again go against Dumont. Dumont doesn't recognize any of these alternative ways of being Indians. They were not Indians in the sense in which we talk about Indians today, but whether it is Kabir or it is Ravidas, Begumpura, or it is Nanak's poetry, or later gurus and many other people. And these were very self-conscious attempts. Not that they tried to annihilate caste, but what they were talking about is humanity of human race, that everyone is human and therefore deserves to be treated equally, deserves to be treated with love and dignity. And these are terms that are there in many of these writings, not only the Sikh gurus, but at the same time, historically, when the colonial rulers come, or caste, untouchability, these differences don't go away simply by religious ideology, because caste is also about materialities, about land ownership, non-ownership, about marginal status, which have historically come to you. And therefore, there are questions, and I've just published a paper, if you're interested, it's called Sikh Religion and Contentions Around Caste. It has come out in this journal called Religions, where I've kind of surveyed the entire literature on caste among Sikhs and where this Dalit movement stands within Sikhism. Sikhs were the first ones to get scheduled caste status in the Indian constitution. Initially, it was given only to Hindu Dalits or Hindu untouchables. Sikhs were the first one to get SC status for their communities, because the Sikh leadership was very keen to get that status. Even the Shromani Gurudwara Prabandhak Committee has seats reserved for scheduled caste. So there is recognition. There is self-recognition that we discriminate still, though our gurus prohibited it. So it's a very interesting kind of trajectory of the way question of caste gets articulated in the Sikh context or the Punjab context.
Just a quick follow-up on that, back to an earlier point you mentioned about Charlesley's work on the pollution line. But just to be clear that, right, I mean, the British, it may put that term into circulation, pollution line, as in those precise terms, but you certainly have strong, empirical evidence, historical evidence of, pre-colonial states legislating. I mean, Divyacharyan's wonderful book on 18th century Marwar, systematically goes through the way this, state in Marwar legislates how close a chamar can get to a temple, for example, legislates, precisely where the achep, or the, untouchable in that Rajasthani language, can can reside and cannot reside, right? It's a very clear spatial distinctions, pollution line, in everything but the English term. Yeah, so just wanted to sort of,
So the point
clarify
is that,
that.
pollution line as an administrative category becomes available to the state in the 1920s. That doesn't mean that pollution did not exist. Pollution line where you list communities below the line, right? So specific communities, for example, in Divya's work, so Muslims are also seen as
Yes.
untouchable in an area. So Muslims are not
Yes.
part of Hinduism, but they were also seen as polluted. And that's very
Right.
critical. I think that's a very critical point, which again goes against Dumont.
I mean, can I just jump in with Priyanka has a question. You know what? Let Priyanka go first, and then if there's any time, I'll ask my question.
Hi, am I audible? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone, for these wonderful presentations. I have two small questions. I wanted to ask Dr. Jolie about the idea of graded inequality and the engagement with graded inequality from a Dumontian perspective that you mentioned from Jaiseelan Raj's perspective paper. Maybe if you could expand a little bit more about that how maybe graded inequality is doing something more that a Dumontian perspective is not doing. The second question that I had was, I appreciate that you both, Dr. Jodhka and Dr. Lee, mentioned domestic work, specifically women, in your empirical examples. My question is, what is what is gender doing to these conceptions of caste and hierarchy, especially when, in a Dumontian perspective, woman is a category with caste. I mean, in a hierarchy of purity, woman itself is a category conceptualized. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Priyanka. Yes, I mean, I'm not sure if I can do justice to Jaiseelan Raj's argument in brief and on the fly, but he's pointing to a compatibility between Ambedkar's notion of graded inequality and Dumont's notion of encompassing of the opposite, seeing these as sort of compatible models for this, system of gradation. Among other things. And then on the question of gender, and also returning to Manali's earlier question about endogamy, yeah, one of the other sort of areas of field work that periodically taps into the old Dumontian questions in surprising ways is it's not hugely common, but it's also not uncommon in this, heavily surveilled scene of sanitation labor, for there to be intercaste unions that sometimes result in marriage between sanitation workers and overseers, or, middle management, right? And that's almost always a caste distinction, right? With the middle management largely consisting of so-called forward castes and backward castes, and the street sweeping, the workforce being almost entirely Dalit. And if we're talking about street sweeping, more than half is women, although it's close to gender parity. So in those, I've met many, couples over the years where there is this, an intercaste marriage, and then the question emerges of what's going to happen to the offspring, and how are they going to manage in the world? I mean, there's the question of how the state is going to recognize them, but more imminently, sort of, how is the community going to do this? And also Shyam of Rajasthan, sociologist who's written quite a lot both in Hindi and in English, has this book that I don't think enough people read, that posits a kind of asprishikaran, a kind of Dalitization, untouchabilization, downward mobility, I think it's called, from upper caste to lower caste or something like that. But that's what often comes up, right? Or what often seems to happen is the family ends up living in the Dalit colony, and the kind of dominant caste or relatively privileged caste middle management person joins the Valmiki community or other sanitation worker communities. So in an interesting way, that sort of is in some ways counterintuitive, but in other ways it points to this kind of the challenges of the pollution paradigm, the weight of the pollution paradigm, the way it constantly comes up, or nobody seems to be able to just sort of transcend it or move past it in this context. I don't know if that answered your question.
Okay, and yeah, I think it did. Otherwise, she would have come back. So I think I just wanted to ask a question because Surinder, you mentioned that one of your criticism of Dumont is that he he assumes that there's a kind of holism, that everyone buys into the caste system, a sense of a kind of unity. But do you really need that holism or that unity to still make the claim that actually there is no way a system like this could be as powerful and perpetuate across so many domains if it didn't have the purchase from almost everybody who's within that system in some respects? I mean, I understand that you could make the argument that there is a lot of coercion and violence to maintain the system, and that is also correct. But that would be a wholly kind of slightly one-sided understanding of the fact that actually things like endogamy or commensality exist across the board, across all the castes from top to bottom. And there is in that sense, he wasn't far from the truth. I think, we may not want to buy in, to the kind of structural holism or concept of unity to try to understand that argument a little bit more. And I think Jasmeet, you want to jump in, it looks like. So do you want to?
Yes, I think it's just building on what you were saying, Manali. And I was also thinking, actually, in the initial chapters of Homo Hierarchicus, Dumont is talking a lot with and to Celestin Bouglé, who actually defines these three different criteria: hereditary, occupation, and I think pollution and purity thing. And then I seem that Dumont is trying to just boil the thing into just one principle. And I think that principle is pollution, and it keeps coming back and forth, either to Divya Cherian's work or going on to Susan Bailey's work when she sort of starts talking also about pollution line and the sort of the patricians moving into urban areas. In Joe Lee's work, about disgust in the city, and in my own research on caste and segregation in the city. And I feel that for me, the relevance of Dumont is sort of lying around this idea of pollution, not that he created it, but I think he put the finger on this very one principle that sort of explains a majority of caste relations. I'm not saying all of them, but I think a majority of it would be explained by this, idea of pollution. And I think it goes back to the example also of the Panditji in your village, where we don't know why he's given respect. Why should a Panditji be given respect if it's not something to do with, even if this Panditji doesn't have power. So I was just thinking about, is that the thing we will sort of take out from Dumont and which sort of still has relevance today?
Panditji is not given respect. Panditji is given patronage. That's what I was trying to say. Because he's a humble person who has been part of the larger kind of biradri or community, and he needs some support, otherwise he will starve. So it was more of a pity rather than the respect. In my context, again, this is kind of my childhood. I can't really say, it was not ethnography. I think this question, Manali, is very, very important question. But my problem with the the way it is often framed, it cannot be done unless you also buy into the other argument of Dumont, that there is something called sui generis India. And that sui generis India is Hindu, and that sui generis India has been there since the 5th century before Christ. And over the past 2,500 years, very little has changed. My argument is that this is empirically not the case. Empirically, historically, contemporaneously, 15th century, 7th century, caste formations have existed, and they have also changed, and they have been different from region to region. And this can also be substantiated by raising this question about the boundaries of caste. So Mapalas are India. What about the Western Punjab? What about Bangladesh? Nepal and Sri Lanka, obviously, they become South Asia. So the moment so there is a kind of built-in methodological nationalism, which is silent, but which is very central to this imagination of India by Western social theory. And this is a much larger problem. I think this is a larger question problem instead of problem, where we need to reimagine South Asia as a diverse region, not as a Hindu region. When Dumont is talking about South India, he's not talking about post-1947 South India, but pre-1947 South India and post-1947 South India as well. If I have to be Indian, I have to also be accountable to my own religious whatever. And my religious baggage is not just Nanak, it is also Farid. Farid is very central to Sikhi and to the region. And Farid doesn't end with Nanak. Farid has large kind of influence of fakirs and babas and these kinds of dargahs are all across. Where do they fall in terms of religious life of different communities, different sections of those communities? If we have to talk about, and the moment we bring in Dumont, all that becomes irrelevant or insignificant or marginal or outside or non-Indic. This is precisely the position of Hindu right wing. So we end up getting trapped into this very nationalist, Hindutva, right-wing kind of narrative about India, which would recognize only. So that is also my political problem. So instead of pollution, if I was to argue, let us replace the word pollution with humiliation. And caste is about institutionalized humiliation at all levels. And this brings in, it helps us to also conceptualize gender. And this question, earlier question that came about, so women, and specifically upper caste Hindu women, not all women, this is very, very critical, are Shudras, they are polluted. And in many South Indian houses, I don't know about North India, there are places outside the house where menstruating women will stay, and she will not be allowed to enter the kitchen. Temples are not allowed, where women are allowed to get. So what is being done? It is actually institutionalization of humiliation. And because of this institutionalized humiliation, women also acquires an identity for herself that she can never be equal to man, right? And I think Ambedkar has some of this, not Dumont. I have not read anything in Dumont where he tries to bring in question of gender. But you can use the word humiliation, and that perhaps is a more useful term than pollution. The moment you bring in humiliation, you bring in relationality, which is also cultural, which is not simply about state power or about economic resources, but humiliation is a felt experience of subordination, of being degraded. And this degradation happens within the so-called upper castes as well. A Brahmin who is death ritual performing Brahmin is lower Brahmin than a Brahmin who is secular Brahmin, or who is Brahmin who does kind of services at a top temple. So there's a very significant hierarchy among Brahmins. So this is again institutionalizing humiliation, and that humiliation is some kind of cultural power, for lack of any other word, and that's how I would respond to it.
Well, thank you very much. I noticed we're just crossed the 3 o'clock mark, at least here UK time, and you've given us a lot of your time and some really lots of things to think about. Absolutely fascinating set of reflections from all three of you. So I want to first thank each one of you, for the speakers, for your time today. And well, I hope we carry on this dialogue at some other time, some other place. But and thank you to everybody who's joined. The video of this recording will be available on the CRASSH website once we have your consent, of course, for the recording to be released. Okay, well, thanks
so much.
everybody, and
Thanks, everyone.
see you at
Appreciate
some
it.
point. Thank you
Likewise,
so
thank
much.
you very much for asking us to
Thank
be
you.
part of this panel. It's been very productive, very useful. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Very
Thank you so
welcome.
much. It is very,
Yeah.
very interesting.
It's great.
Really
Yeah.
appreciate the conversation. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, take care then.
Okay.
Bye. Bye.